Welcome back to our study. This is week 4, lecture 3. And in this lecture, we've now finished again the Guinness book. Of course, we're back to this book, the 5 Views on Apologetics, and we're going to look at chapter 3, the cumulative case for apologetics. Let me say something about my rationale in the way we've done this book. Part of the course description for this course is that we would look at different models for apologetics. And what I wanted to do is to space those out throughout the semester to give each one some time. In other words, we could have taken this book in 5 chapters and done something like what we've done with Guinness, and that is to cover 2 of the chapters in one lecture and 3 in another. But I've decided that in order to kind of get that part of it in, we really needed a separate lecture for each of those. And so that's why we've taken this book kind of slowly and the order we've taken it in. A word about Paul Feinberg, the author. Paul was professor of philosophy of religion and systematic theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for many years. His primary field was philosophy. And he was brother to John Feinberg. And I use the past tense because a few years ago Paul passed away untimely. I was not a friend of Paul's, met him a couple of times, had a conversation with him. I am a friend with his brother John, and had a fairly extensive conversation with him one day about his brother and about the death of his brother. Paul was a brilliant man, both of these theologians, both sons of Charles Feinberg, who was also a prominent theologian in conservative circles in the earlier part of the 20th century, early to mid 20th century. So that gives you a little background on Paul Feinberg. Here is the cumulative case. Now, when you first start the chapter, you might sort of get the sense that, well, this is kind of like the other ones. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to break it up and read each of these chapters separately and devote a whole lecture to each one, because it's really not like the other ones. Remember that in the classical method, the approach that William Craig takes is you begin with proofs for the existence of God. That's where you begin. That's where it starts. If you're going to do it in the Craig fashion, that's where you start. With the Habermas chapter on evidentialism, you start with the resurrection, and that's where you start. But what Feinberg is going to do here is to give not only those 2 approaches, but other approaches as well. And he's essentially going to say, it doesn't really matter where you come in. You could come in at any point. Although he's going to give you his preference for what he thinks should be the starting point. And for him, the preference for the starting point is test for truth. And that's what he deals with, first major heading here. Let me talk about those. I want to say a word about his view on the Holy Spirit and the Spirit's involvement in apologetics. And then sort of jump in to see what his approach is to the other apologetics questions that have been raised. So, test for truth. This is not a new idea. Feinberg did not come up with this. This has been part of philosophy of religion for a long time. I don't know how far back it goes, but it's been there for a long time. And what he does is he lists for us here a group of tests. The first is consistency, and this means that a system of belief must not lead to a contradiction. That when you look at a system of belief, such as Christianity as a worldview, that it's internally coherent, internally consistent. You don't find massive fractures that would make you wonder, how in the world could a person hold to this and believe those 2 mutually contradictory ideas at the same time? You get that with other worldviews. There's no doubt about the fact that in Hinduism, for instance, Hinduism cannot pass this test of consistency. Then the second is test of correspondence, and here he talks about it being the empirical test. Does it correspond with what we know about the world and about life in general? And that this is an important test in his belief, and in my belief, and undoubtedly in your belief as well. The Christian faith does match up. It does fit in to what we think about the world around us. In fact, it fits in very well, especially when you take a creation approach to looking at theology and then look at the world around us and study physics or study biology, the Bible and the Christian faith fits into that very, very well. Third is the test of comprehensiveness. Does it cover all of the major issues? This is one of the problems that we dealt with in the lecture on Chesterton just a few days ago, where Chesterton was talking about mythologies, and he was talking about early attempts at religious expression on the part of the Greeks and the Romans and the Germans. And what he concluded, and what I would conclude as well, is that it doesn't deal comprehensively with the world. Those myths are meant to strike at a certain aesthetic feeling or a certain sensation, but they don't give us really a whole worldview. And what religion must do is it must give us a worldview. Then the test of simplicity. He appeals here to Occam. William of Occam was a 14th century English philosopher, theologian, very famous guy, wrote a great deal, and he talks about Occam's razor. And when Occam described the razor of philosophy, or the razor of dialogue and debate, he said we should cut away those parts of any argument that are really extraneous. And when we come down to it, the simplest argument is very likely the one that is true. And so that's his test of simplicity. The test of livability. This is the pragmatic criterion. And in order for a belief to be true, it must be livable. There's certainly nothing that we would entertain about the Christian faith that says that it's not livable. Doesn't mean it isn't easy, or that it is easy. Doesn't mean that it isn't challenging at times. It doesn't mean that certain things we will never quite live up to, but it certainly touches the livability of life itself. It's not some abstract ivory tower concept, whatever an ivory tower concept might be. Test of fruitfulness. Does it change people's lives? And again, Christianity bears up with that. And then the test of conservation. And here he sort of deals with the whole issue of how we ought not to change a paradigm unless there's a sufficient reason to change it. So when we look at physics, for instance, Newtonian mechanics was prominent in the centuries after Isaac Newton. It seemed to people that he had answered all the questions, but as time went by, it became clear that there were little problems here and there, and that Newtonian mechanics didn't quite answer all those issues that were being raised by physicists. And so as we turn to the 20th century, we have Einstein and Heisenberg and people like that who were able to give more specific answers. They didn't throw Newton out the door, didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but they gave more fine-tuned understandings. So when it comes to a worldview, can we continue to hold on to that as it was originally expressed, or does it need to be modified or done away with? And I think that most of us would want to say, no, we can hang with it. It's all right there. Now, he has a chart then where he chose the work of the Holy Spirit in Apologetics. And I found this interesting. It's interesting to me also that the previous two authors dealt with the work of the Spirit and in Apologetics. And here, he really subsumes everything under the Spirit. And he divides the apologetic focus down to the internal and the external. And the external has to do with the debate or the apologist work itself, the presentation of truths, tests of truth, and evidence, and all of those kinds of things. And then the internal work of the Spirit, which is the Spirit working on the heart of the person who's being witnessed to. So he's got a couple of pages where he deals with that, and I think that that is a very helpful way of thinking about the work of the Holy Spirit. We tend to make the work of the Holy Spirit sometimes only sort of mystical, and we don't deal with the fact or the question of whether the work of the Holy Spirit is sometimes what we might call ordinary, as in the inspiration of the Bible and the giving of the Bible for us. So he wants to talk here about some of these issues that he has raised, and And one of the most interesting parts of this chapter, in my opinion, is his discussion about the witness of the Holy Spirit drawn from religious experience. And so he talks about the fact that people have experiences, but of course people from all over do. But when we come back then and subject the religious experience of a Muslim or of a Hindu, a yoga practicer, or something like that, to the test of truth, they fall down at certain points. But he talks about how the test of religious experience is an important test. And I think that that's something that people in our churches could grab onto if it's well developed. And again, it points to us to the fact that apologetics is apologetics for all of life. It's not just, pigeonholing a few verses and arguments off to the side so that we can use them when we meet a big bad atheist. His discussion about an encounter with Abraham Lincoln I found quite amusing, because when I first began that paragraph, I thought, oh, this is going to go a certain way. It wound up going a completely different way. That we look at Lincoln's life, we read his writings, we read histories of the Civil War, read histories of biographies of Lincoln himself, and certainly your life could be changed through Abraham Lincoln. But how much more so could your life be changed through an encounter with Christ? He gives a summary, and then he considers some objections. Two big objections. The first is the 10 leaky buckets objection. So he says, I built this cumulative case, and somebody might say, well, okay, you have all these different things, but each one of them is not complete in and of itself. And he recognizes that each one is not airtight. There is no airtight proof such that any logical person listening to someone like Paul Feinberg talk would necessarily come to faith in Jesus Christ just as a result of that conversation. Obviously, nothing is completely airtight, but he, I think, defends his cumulative case approach pretty well right here. And then the final thing that he deals with, and this is where we're challenged today, and that is with postmodernity. Because postmodern people don't want to listen to an argument. Postmodern people don't believe there is any such thing as truth. Postmodern people want to believe that everything is a lie. And so he deals with deconstructionism, and that's what deconstructionism is all about. It is the attempt to deconstruct a truth claim and show that that truth claim has something subversive behind it, and that all of the claims to objective truth are nothing but masks, and somewhere we have to take off the mask. He doesn't really say this, but I have said this many times myself. Postmodern people want to take off everybody's mask but their own. And they assume that they, because they're postmodernists, are the only ones in the room who are honest. They're the only ones who are presenting an objective sort of way of looking at things, even though they don't believe in objective truth itself. And so he has got, it's a nice little discussion for about 5 pages of postmodernity and how apologetics can deal with postmodernity. All right, on to next week.